Welcome, Dr. Pope, to Conversations at SC. To start with, let me begin by mentioning a few words about yourself. Dr. Kelly Richmond Pope is an associate professor in the School of Accountancy and MIS at DePaul University in Chicago. Beyond the classroom, Dr. Pope's passion in the study of white-collar crime has resulted in recognition of her expertise in the field of forensic accounting and behavioral aspects of white-collar crime. Dr. Pope has shared her work and research on white-collar crime at seminars around the world, including making presentations to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. To get the discussion going, Dr. Pope, can I ask you what prompted your interest to research on white-collar crime?
Well, I remember being at a white-collar crime conference probably 6 years ago, and there was a presenter there that had recently been released from prison, and he was sharing his story. And I found it fascinating and such a valuable learning experience to learn from someone's experiences. So I thought, what better way to learn about crime than to ask a person that committed a crime? And so I thought that was a very good way to apply all of the theories that I had studied in my PhD program to actual real-life cases. And so that is really what prompted my interest in wanting to develop a documentary and wanting to talk to more white-collar felons throughout the country.
And is there any specific reason for why it needs to be white-collar rather than any other crime?
Well, when I think about my background, I'm an accountant by training and I'm an academic by training. And so my interest and my experience with students, most of the people that I'm educating are going to go into a white-collar profession. So I think I use my experiences in knowing that I see students that are going to be future accountants or future business leaders. I felt like sticking in the white-collar crime area was the best way for me to apply my experiences with my research.
Thank you. Now, you are the producer of the award-winning educational documentary, Crossing the Line, which I had mentioned earlier on. Can you tell us a bit more of this documentary?
Sure. So Crossing the Line is a collection of 4 different stories, and it's broken up into 4 modules. It's a story about a woman that was engaged in embezzlement. It's 2 stories about 2 gentlemen that were engaged in Ponzi schemes, and a story about 2 gentlemen that were engaged in financial statement fraud. And what I wanted to do was to collect stories where people could hear first person from the person that committed the crime. And so a lot of fraud documentaries are stories talking about a case, but you never actually get to hear from the person that committed the crime. And so I wanted to focus on the rationalization aspect, or the behavioral aspect, as we said earlier, of why a person who seemed to have everything going for themselves in their lives, what types of pressure did they experience that would create this opportunity to create crime? So Crossing the Line is a collection of first-person stories, and you get to learn about the case, but you get to also understand the pressures that they experienced.
From your research, is greed the sole motivating factor for those who commit white-collar crimes, or are there any other less obvious reasons for people committing?
I think that's a really good question. I think that greed is the typical answer that you hear, but through my experiences, I've found that a lot of people engage in fraud because they think they won't get caught. So greed might be at the end of the spectrum, where when they first commit a crime, I think that the thought process is anybody watching? The internal controls are not very strong, and so there's an opportunity to engage in fraud. I think once a person realizes that they can get away with it once, twice, or maybe even 3 times, then greed enters the picture. But it typically doesn't start off as a greedy scenario. It often starts off as a mistake. As you'll see in the documentary, the first module is a module with a woman that engaged in embezzlement, and her fraud actually started as a mistake. She charged a personal trip on her corporate card and forgot to correct the mistake. And when she realized that the internal controls in her organization were so weak, she thought, wow, I could really do this again and not get caught. And so often through my experiences, I've found that that tends to be how things start. Not often is it a person that's just greedy and initially they just are trying to figure out a way to manipulate a system. Typically it's just a small misstep, a mistake that leads to something bigger. And so greed ultimately can be where it ends up, but other reasons are a sense of entitlement, an ego. You could have a sick family member. You feel pressure from your CEO or CFO. So greed, I think you hear a lot as the reason, but there are other reasons that I think we all need to be aware of. When we talk about how these scenarios happen, we often refer to the fraud triangle: opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. And so what we find is most people have opportunity. Just the way that jobs are structured today, we have a lot of power and control. So we often have an opportunity to engage or even think about something wrong. And then we often have a lot of pressure. But it's the rationalization component that I spend a lot of my time trying to understand how the opportunity and pressure interface together to allow a person to rationalize engaging in that type of behavior.
Can I just talk about the galleon insider trading in the US? This case shows that white-collar criminals can be high-net-worth individuals with stellar professional jobs. In your opinion, why would such a person risk their reputation and career to commit this offenses?
I think that when a person has all of these accolades, they're not thinking about risking it all. I think that when a person has a lot of power, often they think that nothing could ever happen to them. They could never be caught. And so I don't think that that person is thinking, I'm risking it all making this decision. I think they think, I'm entitled to this. I'm never going to get caught. And oftentimes people can go years without getting caught, and it's that one mistake that brings it to light. But I don't think people typically are thinking, wow, this is going to ruin my life. When I do my interviews with the white-collar offenders, I often ask them that question: did you ever think you would get caught? And that's the furthest thing from their mind. It's almost like with my students when I'm teaching, and you may have a student that's cheating. And when a student is engaging in that type of behavior, they never think about getting caught. They're only thinking about the grade or their GPA or getting an internship or getting a job. They're not thinking about the worst case scenario. So even with insider trading, I know that you have executives that are risking it all, but I don't think they're thinking about that.
Risk is not a factor to them.
Risk is not a factor to them. It's almost like they're going through a cost-benefit analysis, and if I'm successful, the win is so large and the risk is so small. And I think that's what they're thinking about.
On the issue of market abuse and insider trading, in your documentary, you did interview one of your many interviews, I think, one Garrett Bauer.
Yes.
Yeah. And he's a trader who arguably was one of the longest insider trader, I would say, and which resulted in profits in excess of $37 million US. Can you tell us how this case impacted the American public's view on insider trading when he was convicted and sentenced? And in your opinion, what lessons can be learned?
Garrett's case was interesting because it lasted for a very long time, 17 years, which is an extremely long time for an insider trading scheme. And I think that I'm going to use my experiences with going around the country and talking to different students. And what was interesting is most of the time, students didn't feel like insider trading was a major violation. They almost felt like that's the way the market works. And so I think that when you see situations like what Garrett was involved in, it makes investors not as confident in the market. And so, but it's such a gray area because one of the things that Garrett revealed in his interview is he heard information just exchanged freely all the time. And he thought that, well, this is the way business works in this field. And he thought that maybe it was wrong, but he didn't know how wrong it was. So I think that one thing that's important for us to do is make sure we often communicate the problems, what is truly insider trading, so people understand where you go wrong with it. Because I don't know if people truly know when they have insider information and when they're not supposed to trade on it or not supposed to act on it, because it seems like it's just the course of business. Often my students talk about, well, isn't that just how investment banking or trading works? You get information, you know a friend, and you just exchange information and you act on it. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? And I often say, no, it's not what you're supposed to do. But they're very confused about what insider trading is. I think they understand the definition, but when you actually put it into practice, people don't always understand what that means. And I think that we have such a competitive society, and so any piece of information that can make you better than the next person, people tend to act on that. And so I think that people are thinking about that more so than this is an illegal activity, because we're just so competitive by nature.
It's interesting to hear you saying that even your students find it confusing to understand that insider trading is actually not allowed or is illegal. What is your view in terms of how this can be better disseminated in terms of sending the message around?
I think one of the best ways to combat this issue is making sure we're educating with using scenarios in real life cases, and even in our corporate education on our training, letting people see real cases and understanding the decision-making process when people are faced with these choices. And I think if we took that approach, people would think more about scenarios ahead of time than when they're actually faced with them. One of the things that came out with my interview with Garrett is when he was in college, he said he had ethics classes, but they were such on a philosophical level that he never really thought about applying it to his behavior. And so I think that if we spend more time really teaching people how to think through scenarios when they're approached with them, we may see a better outcome.
Instead of just the plain letter definition of what is right and what is wrong.
Absolutely. I think that when you talk to people about right and wrong, I think they put up a fence, they put up a guard, because everyone thinks they're a great person. And so if I asked you, are you a good person? You're going to say absolutely. But if we started talking about scenarios, we might understand that we could think differently. We may have completely different thoughts and views when we look at a different scenario. So I think if we teach from a scenario-based way and if we train people from a scenario-based way, we would find a very different response in their behavior.
Has it got anything to do with the notion that some people think that insider trading is a victimless crime?
I think some people do think it's a victimless crime. I think that people think large corporations are just large corporations that can lose money, and they don't often think about people make up large corporations. When corporations lose money, people get laid off, people lose jobs. And so I don't think that often we think full circle about the impact when a company loses a lot of money. So I do think people think it's a victimless crime, and when you compare white-collar crime to, say, street crime, people think, oh, street crime is violent. It's terrible if you stole someone's purse, but if you steal money from a corporation, they can recover. They have insurance. They're set up that way. And so I think that often people think it's not a victimless crime. And when you listen to the stories of the Madoff investors that lost life savings, or even people that were impacted by financial statement fraud that lost their jobs. You know, when you hear those stories, it really becomes real. When you hear a 55-year-old person who's lost their retirement and can't be employed anymore because they're just older in the marketplace, that has more of an impact.
In relation to the outcomes of enforcement actions, or rather the prosecution of individuals, do you see that high imprisonment terms is really necessary to send a message out to deter?
I think that high prison sentences is necessary because, and just taking my experiences from the classroom, when students hear that someone can steal, embezzle, profit $10 million and go to jail for 3 years, they think, wow, I would do that. And that's not the message that we want to send. But if you thought that you were going to go to jail for 10 years, they think about that a little bit differently. So I think right now, especially in the U.S., there's so much subjectivity around sentencing that I think by sending lower sentences, we send a message that the cost benefit, it may be worth it, and that's definitely not what we want to say. But I think that low prison sentences sends a message that, yeah, we're just going to smack you on the hand. It's bad, but you can recover from it. And often students see people recover from it. And that's probably not the message that we want to send.
And Garrett Bauer had 9.5 years.
Yeah, Garrett Bauer was sentenced to 9.5 years. And even I think 9.5 years is a long time, but when I talk to my students, they're saying, wow, $37 million, 9.5 years, I could do it. I mean, if I could live like a king off $37 million for 17 years, and I just have to go to jail for 9.5 years and maybe only have to do 85% of that prison sentence, it might be worth it. And so we don't want people to think through situations like that. And not that I want to send everybody to jail for years on end, but there has to be some type of punishment for the types of behaviors, especially if it's destroying the faith that we have in the markets.
How is it impacting the ordinary man on the road?
That's a really interesting question because what I've tended to focus my research on is the manager and lower level employee that's involved in crime. And I remember reading an article a couple of years ago, and it said that the mid to lower level manager tends to be the person that is prosecuted and goes to jail in comparison to your C-level executives. And this article was talking about comparing these two categories of people, because typically CEOs and CFOs and your C-level executives have the money to fight and often win. And when you talk about mid-tier managers or lower-level managers that are engaged in fraud, they typically don't have the resources to fight. And so they often are the ones that end up being caught, being sentenced, and going to jail. So I think it has an impact on the average working person. Unfortunately, I don't think we always think about the impact that it can have.
Yeah, and what again you're mentioning is very true, and it's universal in nature, I would think. The more fortunate ones can afford the best representation.
Right.
The less fortunate.
You saw that in one of the interviews I did, and one of the cases I focused on in the documentaries on Health South. And with Health South, the CEO was able to spend millions on a legal defense team. Now, he ultimately went to jail for a different cause, but he wasn't found guilty initially of the accounting fraud, and he was able to fight. And so the mid-tier manager typically can't spend millions of dollars on a defense team to fight an allegation. And so I think that white-collar crime does have a major impact on the ordinary man.
What do you think financial regulators should do to ensure that white-collar crimes such as market abuse and the likes of insider trading are more viewed seriously then?
Well, I think that speaking out more on the topics, making sure people understand what market abuse means and what types of actions and behaviors are defined as market abuse first is important. And I think sharing experiences of what happens when a person does engage in market abuse, and not just the prison part, but the impact on society. And I think that's important, because I think that when people realize that my behavior can impact jobs or depress job growth, I think that resonates with people in a different way. So I think the more regulators speak out, the more they're able to educate the community and society, I think that can start changing behavior. I also think listening to whistleblowers can also be very helpful. When you look at the research and find that most fraud is discovered by tips, we need to make sure that we are letting employees in organizations know that you will be supported, and if you see something, you should definitely say something, because typically the people in the inside have the information. And so I think internal employees can work hand in hand with regulators, and if they feel supported by the regulators, I think we could solve this epidemic.
Going to the question of ethics, how does it have a role in combating white-collar crime?
I think ethics has a role. I think that most employees walk into an organization with their personal ethics, but most organizations have a corporate ethics too. They have a culture. And so sometimes that corporate ethics culture and your personal ethics can clash. So I think if we make sure that the corporate ethics that we are telling people to adopt is strong, then that can really help us deter white-collar crime and internal theft and employee theft. So I think it's a very important role, and I think we can shape it through corporate education and training.
And obviously it starts from the top.
It starts from the top. You hear a lot of mention of tone at the top and how tone at the top really impacts the shape of an organization. Something I like to talk about is tone at the middle, because tone at the top is important. I think the tone at the top shapes the vision, but typically the tone at the middle is how the policies are executed. And so you want to make sure you have the right message, but then you also want to look at the tone in the middle to make sure the execution of those policies happen. And I say that because often when I'm interviewing mid-level managers, what they'll say is, we knew what the policy was, but the way we executed it was very different. We had to cut corners to make sure that we were efficient with our time. And so paying attention to tone at the middle is, I think, equally as important as paying attention to the tone at the top and making sure those two messages are the same. Tone at the top is a very overused concept. And it's important, don't get me wrong, it's very important. But we also need to look at tone at the middle, because a lot changes between those levels. And most organizations are hierarchical, right? So it's very different what the C-level says and how it gets executed. And so we just need to make sure all those tones are the same.
Well, Dr. Kelly Pope, thank you very much for being with us at Conversations at SC.
Thank you for having me.
And hopefully we'll see you again sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.